My name is Elena Carter. I'm 28 years old, and for nearly 3 years, my parents made sure no one in my state would hire me. Every time I applied for a job, someone would call the manager and quietly warn them that I had a criminal record. Theft, fraud, violence. None of it was true. I'd never been arrested. I'd never even had a parking ticket. But by 27, I was sleeping in a homeless shelter and washing my hair in a gas station sink because every opportunity vanished the same way, one phone call at a time. My father texted me every week, "Come home and apologize. Maybe I'll stop." Then one morning, a stranger knocked on the shelter door and said 7 words that changed everything. "Your grandmother asked me to find you. Before I continue, tell me where you're listening from." My name is Elena Carter, and I grew up in a town so small that everyone knew when a new truck appeared on Main Street. Silver Creek, Iowa. Population just under 4,000. 1 grocery store, 1 diner, 1 high school, and a church on every corner. People waved from their porches there. They borrowed sugar from neighbors and returned it with homemade pie. On the surface, my family looked exactly like the kind people admired. My father, Thomas Carter, had spent nearly 20 years managing a grain processing plant outside town before it shut down. My mother, Linda, organized charity drives at church and never missed a school fundraiser. If you asked anyone in Silver Creek about the Carters, they'd say we were good people who raised a quiet, respectful daughter. Inside our house, things worked differently. I didn't have a key to the front door until I was 19. My father said keys were for people who had something to hide. If I wanted to go anywhere more than a few miles away, I had to tell him where, why, and when I would be back. When I started working at the local diner at 15, bussing tables after school, my mother opened a joint bank account to help me manage my money. Every paycheck went straight into that account. I never saw the statements. I didn't question it. Questioning things in our house usually ended with my father reminding me how lucky I was to have a roof and food. I was a good student. I graduated near the top of my class. One of my teachers pulled me aside during my senior year and told me I could easily get scholarships for college if I applied. I brought the brochures home with a mix of excitement and fear. My father didn't even read them. He placed the papers on the kitchen counter and said college filled young people's heads with nonsense. According to him, the world was dangerous, and daughters stayed close to their families if they wanted to stay safe. So I stayed. I cooked dinner most nights, cleaned the house, helped my mother with paperwork for church events, and listened to my father talk about how people who left town usually came crawling back. At the time, I thought it was normal. Families protect each other. Parents worry. At least that's what I told myself. The only person who ever treated me like I had a future beyond Silver Creek was my grandmother, Eleanor Hayes. She lived on a small farm outside town and had a habit of watching people very carefully before she spoke. When I visited her, she'd pour sweet tea on the porch and ask questions no one else asked about my plans, my dreams, the things I wanted for myself. Once, when I was 23, she looked at me with an expression I didn't understand and said quietly, "Elena, one day you might have to choose between peace and obedience. If that day comes, choose peace." At the time, I didn't know she had already started preparing for that choice. For most of my early 20s, life in Silver Creek moved in the same quiet loop. I worked small jobs around town, helped my mother with church events, and handled most of the errands that kept our house running. On the surface, nothing seemed wrong, but slowly, the expectations around me began to tighten like invisible threads. My father had strong opinions about what kind of life I should live. According to him, the world outside Silver Creek was dangerous and filled with people who took advantage of young women who thought they were smarter than their families. Whenever I mentioned applying for work in another town or taking night classes at the community college, he would shake his head like I was talking about jumping into a fire. "You're not ready for that kind of world," he would say calmly. "People out there will chew you up." My mother supported him, though she did it more quietly. She'd stand at the kitchen counter, drying dishes that were already clean, and tell me things like, "Your father just wants to protect you. Girls your age make terrible mistakes when they rush into independence." At first, their concern sounded reasonable. Parents worry, families give advice. But the older I got, the more those conversations started to feel less like advice and more like permission I was supposed to ask for. When I turned 25, I tried to push against that invisible boundary for the first time. I started applying for jobs outside Silver Creek, nothing dramatic. Just retail work or administrative positions in nearby towns about 20 or 30 minutes away, places where people didn't know my parents. Each time I applied, something strange happened. The interviews went well. Managers seemed interested. A few even told me they would call within a couple of days, but then the calls never came. Sometimes I received short emails saying the position had been filled. Other times, I heard nothing at all. At first, I assumed it was normal rejection. Finding work isn't easy in small towns. But after the fourth or fifth time, a pattern started to form that I couldn't ignore. Every opportunity disappeared almost immediately after the interview. Then one afternoon, after a promising interview at a hardware store in a town 20 minutes away, the manager called me back. His voice sounded uncomfortable. "Elena," he said carefully, "before we go any further, is there anything in your background we should know about any legal trouble?" My stomach dropped. "No," I said. "Of course not." There was a long pause on the other end of the phone. "Well," he replied quietly, "someone called us yesterday and said you had a felony record." That was the moment I realized something was very wrong. For a while, I tried to convince myself it was a misunderstanding. Maybe someone had confused me with another person. Maybe the manager had received the wrong information. Small towns are full of rumors that grow larger every time they're repeated. I wanted to believe that was all it was. But over the next 6 weeks, the same thing happened again and again. A grocery store in Ridgeford, a shipping warehouse near the county line, a diner that needed a morning hostess. Each interview started the same way: friendly conversation, hopeful smiles, promises to follow up soon, and each one ended with the same quiet shift in tone, the same uncomfortable question about my background. The third time it happened, the diner owner didn't hide the truth. She leaned forward across the counter, lowering her voice like she was sharing a secret. "Honey," she said, "someone called here about you." My chest tightened. She didn't give a name. Said she was a concerned neighbor. Claimed you'd been arrested for fraud and theft. For a moment, the room felt like it had tilted sideways. I thanked her for being honest and walked outside without another word. The air was cold, and I stood there, staring at the empty parking lot, trying to force the pieces together in my head. Someone was following my job applications. Someone was calling employers before they could hire me. That night, after my parents went to bed, I walked quietly down the hallway toward my mother's sewing room. It was the only room in the house that was completely hers, and she kept the door closed most of the time. Inside, the desk drawer slid open with a soft scrape. Under a stack of fabric patterns and envelopes, I found a small blue notebook. I opened it. Written in my mother's careful handwriting was a list of places I had applied for work. Next to each one was a red check mark. My hands went cold as the realization settled in. This wasn't coincidence. It was a system, and the people destroying my future weren't strangers. They were my parents. The night I found that notebook, something inside me finally broke, but not the way my parents expected. I didn't scream. I didn't confront them right away. I simply sat on the edge of my bed in the dark, the blue notebook resting in my hands, and read every name written inside it. Hardware stores, diners, warehouses, offices in towns 20 or 30 miles away, each one followed by the same red check mark. Neat and deliberate, like my mother had been completing a routine task on a grocery list. By morning, the shock had turned into something colder and far more useful: clarity. I placed the notebook on the kitchen table while my parents were eating breakfast. My mother froze the moment she saw it. My father glanced down, then calmly buttered a piece of toast, as if nothing unusual had appeared between us. "Explain this," I said. My mother's eyes filled with tears almost instantly. "Elena, you went through my things. You called my employers." I replied quietly. "You told them I was a criminal." "I did it because I love you," she insisted, pressing her hand against her chest like she'd been wounded. "You don't understand how dangerous the world is for a young woman alone. I'm 25. My father finally spoke, his voice steady and almost bored. "We're protecting you by destroying every job opportunity I have. You think you're ready to live out there," he said, shaking his head slightly. "You've never survived on your own. You'd be back here in a week." I looked from one of them to the other and felt something shift deep inside my chest. "This stops today," I said. My father leaned back in his chair. "Just that one word. Simple. Final. If you keep doing this," I told him, "I'm leaving." He didn't hesitate. "You walk out that door," he said calmly. "You walk out with nothing. No money. No documents. No help. This house. This family. Everything you have comes from us." I believed he was bluffing. That night, I packed a backpack anyway. 2 changes of clothes, my phone charger, a photograph of my grandmother that I kept beside my bed. When I walked into the hallway with the bag over my shoulder, my parents were already standing there waiting. My mother crossed her arms. "If you leave," she said coldly, "don't expect to come back." My father didn't raise his voice. He simply stepped aside and opened the front door. "Go ahead," he said. And that was the moment my life finally split into 2 pieces, everything before that door and everything after it. 8 months after I walked out of my parents' house, I found myself standing in the lobby of the Silver Creek Community Center on a cold Thursday night. The monthly town council meeting was about to start. Rows of folding chairs filled the room. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. People from town stood in small groups, talking quietly, the same way they always did before meetings about potholes, school budgets, or zoning permits. But that night, everyone had come for a different reason. They had come to watch my family fall apart. My father was already there when I walked in. Thomas Carter stood near the front row, wearing his best blue button-down shirt, the one he used for church services and public events. My mother sat beside him with a tissue pressed to her eyes. For months, they had controlled the story in Silver Creek. They told neighbors I had run away with bad influences. They said I had emotional problems. They claimed I had fallen into dangerous situations and refused their help. For a long time, people believed them. But things had started to change after the lawsuit was filed. Court documents are public records in Iowa, and in a town like ours, people read public records the way they read gossip columns. Slowly, quietly, the truth had begun circulating through the same streets where my parents had spread their version of the story. 37 recorded phone calls to employers. 5 fabricated police reports. 1 impersonation of a social worker trying to get me removed from a homeless shelter. None of those facts were rumors. They were evidence. I took a seat in the 3rd row. Beside me sat Victoria Hale, the attorney my grandmother's lawyer had recommended. She looked calm, almost bored. As she flipped open a thin folder on her lap, my father walked to the podium. He cleared his throat and looked around the room like a man who had spent his whole life believing the crowd would always be on his side. "Most of you know me," he began. "I've lived in Silver Creek for over 30 years. My wife and I raised our daughter here. We taught her right from wrong." A few people nodded politely. "But lately," he continued, "there's been a lot of misinformation going around about my family." He paused for dramatic effect. "My daughter has filed a lawsuit against us, claiming we sabotaged her career and reputation." He shook his head slowly. "That's not the truth. The truth is, we tried to protect her from making terrible mistakes. She left home and fell under the influence of people who encouraged her to turn against her own parents." Then he looked directly at me. "I'm asking this community to remember the family you've known all these years." For a moment, the room was completely silent. Then Victoria stood up. She didn't raise her voice. "My name is Victoria Hale," she said calmly. "I'm a civil litigation attorney licensed in the state of Iowa, and I represent Elena Carter." Several heads turned. The complaint filed in county court includes extensive documentation of defamation and interference with employment opportunities. All of those records are public and available for anyone here to review. She held up a thin stack of papers. 37 recorded phone calls made by Mrs. Carter to employers, falsely claiming her daughter had a criminal record. My mother's face drained of color. 5 fabricated documents designed to resemble official police reports. My father's hands tightened around the edges of the podium. And 1 documented attempt to impersonate a licensed social worker in order to have Ms. Carter removed from the homeless shelter where she was residing. The room erupted in quiet whispers. Victoria continued speaking in the same calm tone. "The court has already reviewed this evidence. 11 days ago, a civil protection order was issued preventing Mr. and Mrs. Carter from contacting my client directly or indirectly." She looked toward the council chair. "We are not here to argue this case tonight. But since Mr. Carter has chosen to address the community publicly, I believe the community deserves access to the same facts the court has already reviewed. She sat down. For 8 full seconds. Nobody spoke. My father remained standing at the podium, staring down at the papers in front of him like they might somehow disappear if he waited long enough. Then the council chair cleared his throat awkwardly. "Thank you," he said. "We'll move on to the next agenda item." My father slowly stepped away from the microphone. He didn't look at me again, but the damage had already been done. In a town like Silver Creek, reputation is everything. And for the first time in my life, my parents were no longer controlling the story. The truth was, the town of Silver Creek didn't explode overnight. It changed the way small towns always do quietly, one conversation at a time. At first, people just read the court records. Then they started talking. Neighbors who had once comforted my parents began asking uncomfortable questions. The diner owner who had turned me away months earlier called my lawyer's office and offered to testify. A manager from a warehouse outside town forwarded the email he'd received with the fake police report still attached. The truth moved slowly through the community. But once it started moving, it didn't stop. My father refused to admit he had done anything wrong, even after the court ruled against him and ordered damages for defamation. He insisted the entire case was a misunderstanding created by lawyers who didn't understand family. Eventually, he had to sell the house on Maple Street to cover the judgment. My mother surprised me. Though, months later, I learned from someone in town that she had started seeing a therapist. Apparently, during one of her sessions, she said something that stayed with me when I heard it later. "I think I might have hurt my daughter in ways I didn't understand." It wasn't an apology, not really, but it was the first honest sentence anyone in my family had spoken about what happened. As for me, life became quiet in the best possible way. I rented a small 1-bedroom apartment in Millfield. I started working at a law office doing administrative work, organizing case files, answering phones, and learning how the legal system actually worked. Slowly, I began taking evening classes at the community college, and something unexpected happened as people heard my story. Friends, co-workers, even parents I barely knew started talking more openly about the pressure they sometimes placed on their children. A few admitted they had been afraid of losing control over their families and hadn't realized how damaging that fear could become. If my story helped even one parent choose understanding instead of control, then the years I spent fighting for my independence meant something. The pain didn't disappear, but it became part of a life I finally owned. If you've ever had to choose between your freedom and your family's expectations, then you understand how complicated that decision can be. Sometimes, love means staying. Sometimes it means walking away so you can finally breathe. If this story resonated with you, share it with someone who might need to hear it. And if you have a story like this of your own, I'd really like to read it in the comments.